webinar, beginning of week 2 of the Festival of Learning. It's with great pleasure that I would like to introduce our panel. On the panel today, we're going outside of London, which is a good thing, and talking to some colleagues in Yorkshire and Humber region. Firstly, I have with us Abdu Sidibe, who's the head of regional, currently the head of regional funding for Yorkshire and Humber for the National Community Lottery Fund. Welcome, Abdu. With Abdu, we have also Kate Hainsworth, who is the Chief Executive of Leeds Community Foundation and Give Bradford. And then I'm also joined by 2 rocket science colleagues in the shape of Lisa Hornung, who's the Data and Analytics Lead for Rocket Science, and James Turner. James is a former Associate Director at Rocket Science and now a Senior Associate with us. We're going to spend a little bit of time this afternoon talking to you about a project that was commissioned, I think back in 2018, by the National Lottery Community Fund and a group of the region's funders, including a number of the community foundations, of which obviously Kate is representing one, 2 ridings being another one, and the Yorkshire Funders Forum, which is a similar body to the London Funders Organisation in the capital. We wanted to use this festival to showcase a piece of research that we undertook on behalf of the funders in the region for a number of different reasons, because it's, I think, brings together a number of topical themes and issues that are current, very topical in grant making at the moment. It's an example of funder collaboration in action. It's about place-based funding and how you become better at it. We are, as I've said, trying to extend beyond London and learn from outside, recognizing that we don't have all the answers. And I think possibly as interestingly as anything, it's about how you make better use of data and real-time data to make better decisions. As my colleagues James and Lisa will explain in a moment or two, it is also a live project. We're telling you about the original piece of research back in 2018-19 and what that told us, and we'll engage with Abdu and Kate to understand how they used that research. But it's also a piece of work that's actually being updated at the moment. And in that regard, we would welcome input from yourselves when you hear about it as to how you think we could develop that and potentially take it to other places and other regions. So in terms of the format for the remainder of the session, we're going to hear a presentation now from James and Lisa. That should be about 15, up to maybe 15 minutes or so. And then I'm going to open up with a Q&A with the panel and hopefully encourage questions from the audience and get a real good discussion going on this particular topic, finishing up no later than 5 to 2. So that's the agenda, that's what we're hoping to cover. And without further ado, I'm going to ask James to share his screen so that we can get into the meat of the presentation. Thank you all.
Okay. Well, hello everybody, and yes, the first challenge is the Zoom sharing the screen challenge. Let's see how we get on. In which case, I'm hoping that everybody can now see the presentation, tools to enhance place-based funder collaboration. And as John was saying, what we're going to be talking about is some research that Rocket Science undertook on behalf of the funders in Yorkshire and Humber, particularly the National Lottery and Leeds Community Foundation, the 2 Ridings Community Foundation, but also the Yorkshire Funders Forum as a whole. And it was research that we completed in 2019, analysing giving and funding made in the 3 financial years, 15-16, 16-17, 17-18. And as John was also saying, it's particularly pertinent because just in the last couple of months, we've started to do the research again, and we've got a range of enhancements which Lisa's going to pick up at the end of this presentation. But anyway, back to the research in 2019. First of all, yeah, a big question, why? What was the point of the research? And I think mainly it was to fill something of a vacuum, because I think each year NCVO produce their Civil Society Almanac, which has lots and lots of information on the funding which is received by the VCSE sector. But it doesn't really tell an awful lot about the individual funders giving out the money. And also, when you're trying to look at that sort of finer grain local authority level of the data, the Civil Society Almanac, although incredibly comprehensive, doesn't reach down much beyond the regional level. And so to try and fill that vacuum and provide some answers and some insights which could hopefully promote collaboration between funders, I think that was the essence of the work. And as it says there, we felt the research could give local funders more insight about distribution. It give the funders themselves a tool to approach local authorities and other bodies to look at better ways of collaboration and complementing work. And also at a national level, you give local funders a tool to say, this is the picture in Yorkshire and Humber, this is where we think national funders can help us the most. And in terms of what we did, it was three main activities. That first of all, we reviewed some of the regional level information which is available through the Civil Society Almanac. Secondly, we looked at data for those funders which are on 360 Giving, the open access data source on grant giving. But clearly, as is the case in London, it's also the case in Yorkshire and Humber, lots of funders haven't got their information on 360 Giving. So quite a large step was trying to collate that information directly from Yorkshire Funders Forum members. A slight word on terminology here. Until a couple of years ago, and Abdu and Kate can put me right on this, that there used to be two different funders forums in Yorkshire and Humber. There was the Yorkshire Grant Makers Forum, which was typically the smaller independent trust and foundation, and then there was a Yorkshire and Humber Funders Forum, which is typically the larger national bodies, including the national lottery funders. And after we completed our research, those two bodies merged into a combined Yorkshire Funders Forum, which is the entity in place today. But some of my slides refer to the old body, so here we've got the Yorkshire Grant Makers Forum. Anyway, onwards and upwards. And then using that research, we produced a dashboard tool that people could use to analyse the grants data that we produced, and we've got a little demonstration of that coming up in a couple of minutes. And we also produced a report which we've set out some of the key findings from that report in the next few slides. First of all, this is a summary from the Civil Society Almanac, And one of the things you can do with the NCVO Almanac is look at the income of the VCS within each region. And by looking at the population sizes, Yorkshire and Humber total population around about 5.5 million, as opposed to London's around about 9 million. But in terms of the VCS income per head, Yorkshire and Humber far, far lower than London. And this is perhaps not surprising, because civil society Almanac data is based on the location of the grant recipients, and clearly there are many, many large national charities which have their headquarters in London. Each year, the civil society Almanac is skewed towards London, and that's probably not a true reflection of the funding which is aimed at local organisations coming into the VCS. But even so, clearly all the other regions, with the exception of London, that sort of weighting towards HQs doesn't really apply. And Yorkshire and Humber was still coming out at the bottom of the list, or in this case at the top of the list. But clearly that's not a place that the region particularly wanted to be. But flipping from the negative side to the positive side, I think what we were able to do was to, as I say, probably for the first time, produce a breakdown of about £100 million worth of funding each year coming into the Yorkshire and Humber region. And you can see that by far the largest element of this funding was the National Lottery distribution body. So that's the National Lottery Community Fund, National Lottery Heritage Fund, Arts Council for England, and Sport England. And in comparison to charitable trusts and foundations, you can see it's quite a proportion of the funding that we were able to analyse. One of the things that we didn't look at was funding awarded by grants funding awarded by local authorities, and for a couple of reasons. I think first of all that none of the local authorities had 360 giving data available, so we'd have to approach them individually, and also I think it becomes a bit messier when you look at local authorities, because you get a sort of a blend of things which are truly and purely grants, through to things which are service level agreements, through to things which are contracts which are awarded to voluntary organisations. And I think with those challenges and with the timescales available, and with the focus on Yorkshire Funders Forum members, we felt it far better to do more detailed and accurate analysis of just the National Lottery distribution bodies alongside trusts and foundations, both local and national. And yeah, expanding upon that last slide, this gives a breakdown of those largest funders, and you can see again within the 4 NLDBs, it really was the National Lottery Community Fund which was providing the lion's share of grants to VCSE organisations. And then going down the list, you can see number 5 is a local organisation, number 7 is a local organisation, but that's number 15, but that's mixed in with quite a few of the large national funders as well. All right, we've got a couple of maps, and clearly if we've got a largely London-based audience, this might not be a map that you're quite as familiar with as the map of the London boroughs, but this is showing where the funding goes, not proportional to population, just in terms of sheer overall size. And within Yorkshire and Humber, in terms of population, the largest local authority is Leeds. It's also the largest city, and therefore that kind of HQ effect of where regional charities is based also comes into play a bit. But it's probably when we're looking at grants recipients, the location of grants recipients, it's probably going to look like more of those are based in Leeds. This map shows the distribution of different funders, where funders have made at least one award, and again, Leeds is probably coming out at the top of that list. It's a bit of a donut with a Selby-shaped hole in the middle. Selby is one of the districts within North Yorkshire County Council. And perhaps it's a little dissimilar from other district councils in North Yorkshire, which tend to be much larger and more rural. And then finally, when you do look at it proportional to population, you get this rather strange effect that one of the local authorities, the district councils in North Yorkshire is way up the top. And I think this was largely because of a very large National Lottery Heritage Fund award coming through to that area. I'm just going to skip through these a bit. We try to look at the weighting to see if there's much weighting towards more deprived local authorities. And this is the list from the most deprived local authority in Yorkshire and Humber through to the least. And this was the amount of funding per head. And you can see there really isn't much of a pattern, actually. And in fact, when you try and put a trend line on it, the trend is actually the least deprived ones are getting fractionally more per head. And perhaps we can maybe pick that up in some of the discussion about why that might be. And then very, very quickly, this is the dashboard that we produced in 2019, which is essentially based around Microsoft Excel. And you could filter by the type of funder, or you could filter by one or more individual funders. And here, just as an example, I chose a filter of 6 of the national funders. And then on a separate sheet, you could do the same, but filtering by local authority rather than filtering by funder to get the breakdown given by the different funders. And this, I think, is where this presentation segues into what Lisa is going to, oh, sorry, my mistake, one more, which was just given the breakdown within Leeds. That surely is the point at which I'm going to hand over to Lisa, because what we've got here is a mock-up of the tool that we're hoping to produce for the 2021 research. So on that note, Lisa, sorry, I've probably used a couple more minutes than I should have done, but Lisa, over to you.
Thank you, James. Yeah, so I will be talking very briefly about the research that we just started. In some ways, we want to update what we've done before, but we also wanted to add new features in terms of the outputs, so like the tools we're using, but also the actual data and the analysis and insights that we can provide. So the first change that we're introducing is that we wanted to create a dashboard that is more, that can be shared more widely externally, and that will be more useful in terms of its functionality as well. So we decided to go with Google Data Studio, which is a very easy to use dashboarding tool. And this is what we kind of mocked up. It might not be what it looks like when we actually get to it, but in terms of its functionality and the types of findings that we want to show, this is probably what it will look like. James, can I ask you to go through kind of the features, the next slides? So just to kind of highlight what makes it a bit better when compared to Excel. So there's more ability to filter. So we are able to provide more kind of functionality to the user to kind of drill down to the findings depending on what they want to look at. So you can filter by funder, by the local authority, the years when the funding was given, and the grant sizes. Then we will have an interactive map. So that will actually be, we have interactive tables and charts. So that means you can actually use the charts and the tables we have here to filter the other charts that we have there. And the last feature that makes it better compared to Google is that you actually can embed maps. So we can kind of look at where the funding goes, and people again can click on the map, see a couple more details, and also use that as a filter. So that's on the kind of output side. But what we also add, so as I said, we want to update what we've done in 2019, because we found, and you will hear, that it was very useful to the funders in the region to inform various decisions and kind of on the practical side. So we wanted to base our research on that, but improve the data visualization tool. And also we wanted to add a bit more detail to the analysis that we've done with the 360 giving data, to provide more information on the types of organizations that funding is given to. 360 giving data has a standard kind of format, and usually it doesn't really tell you the types of organization that funding is given to, but we know that this is of a lot of interest to people. So we're doing a bit of exploratory analysis to see if we can classify organizations. This is kind of easily looking at legal status, for example, so to see the split between registered charities and social enterprises or other types of organizations, but also drill a bit below that as well to see if we can split charities, for example, into different groups as well, to see if how much funding went to community groups versus village halls or sports clubs, for example. So that is kind of a add-on this year. And in addition, as James was kind of highlighting, we've been using the NCVO Almanac to look at what the local VCSE funding or kind of sector looks like compared to other regions. But this year, we're actually going to access the raw data from the Charity Commission, and that will allow us to provide a bit more insights on what the local voluntary sector looks like in terms of organizations, where they're based within the region, not just the local authority itself, and also what their makeup is in terms of income sizes and where they operate, because there might also be some that working nationally, not just locally, and we can look at what that proportion looks like and the makeup of those organizations. And now, yeah, I will hand back to John to facilitate the session further.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Thanks, James. Contact details are up on that slide. Should you want to follow up with either James or Lisa on specific things, we will make sure that via Grace and colleagues at London Funders, these slides are made available, not just to everyone here, but also to anyone who'd like to pursue this information further. So, James, could you please stop sharing, and thank you ever so much. I'm just going to kick off then briefly with a panel discussion. We've already got some questions coming in as well, which is fantastic. So I'll try and I'll kick off with a couple of questions of my own, and then bring questions in from the Q&A, and keep those coming, please. So I just want to kick off, maybe start off with Abdu as the head of region with the National Community Lottery Fund. It'd be great to hear, Abdu, your take on why you commissioned this piece of work, but more, I think, interestingly, how have you used it? How has it been of practical use to you and your colleagues as funders on a place-based way?
Thank you, John. Yeah, I mean, why did we commission it? We came from conversations within the Yorkshire Funders Forum. And at the time, I was still fairly new to my roles. I just joined as head of region, and I'm leading a team of funding officers who operate at a local level and trying to make regional decision making. And I guess personally, I thought it was always very difficult to get a sense of our contribution in the sector. And I think that the makeup of the region is quite complex, with rural areas, urban areas, coastal communities. The government structure is quite complicated in terms of local authorities. There's quite a lot of community foundation, trust and foundation. So it's always getting a sense of what value you add is quite difficult. And even though we had some good relationships with other funders, we didn't really have a narrative. So I think we had conversation about potentially mapping out the investment in the region. And that's purely now, it was just to get a sense as to what is our collective contribution as funders. So for me, what's been really useful on a personal level is really helped me to kind of develop really good conversation with other funders and kind of look at areas where we had shared interest and shared contribution in particular places within the region. So a good example was with Kate, actually, because it's the research that was a catalyst for us collaborating on a healthy holiday program in Bradford. So that was almost our first sort of opportunity for us to test out an approach to work together and see how that would work, really. It was useful for other funders who are not necessarily used to share data, and some were quite reluctant in the first place, really. But I think they've seen the results is that the ability to see across 53 different funders our overall contribution, all of us had a narrative to say over, 3-year period, 2015 to 2018, we contributed over £300 million of funding in the voluntary community sector. And that's a great story to be able to tell. And then, you go obviously then areas where, there's maybe not as much investment going. But again, that leads you to think about how can we work together to improve the situation. So again, there's places like Wakefield where there was a recognition that we could do for more, with more investment. And actually we brought together some stakeholders in the area to look at ways in which we could work together. And interestingly, just sharing the data and us getting those groups together was the first time they got together to actually talk about the place. So that in itself, coming together, the data helped to do that. And the next bit was, how do we increase investment in the area? So we collaborated with the health sector, for example, in the pandemic, looking at additional funding to those most affected by the pandemic, really. There's also a forum in Sheffield that just started a couple of months ago, again, based on the data and the recognition to come together, really.
Fantastic, Abdu. Thank you. Kate, from your perspective as a CEO of a community foundation, how have you found the data and how have you put it to use?
Yeah, thanks, John, and and hi everyone. I think the simple fact is the urgency or the curiosity about what the data might tell us hugely predates us actually getting the data. So I think Abdu's point that the data has led to this kind of flourishing of new initiatives has had a kind of a long lead in, because it was incredibly frustrating previously. And I guess that's on the back of the levelling up agenda. It goes all the way back to decades really of gut feeling, but not really understanding about how the levelling up or the potential to level up might manifest itself. And I think particularly for us as a very grassroots organisation, but an organisation that is operating at scale, we're delivering around, well, somewhere between 3 and 6 million each year into our geographies. So it's not a tiny operation, but at the same by the same token, we do feel somewhat isolated in terms of understanding that particular element of the ecology that we're serving. And so it's been an amazing resource A, to get the data, but B, to work alongside fellow funders with a common interest. And so that coming together with Abdu and Jan at Two Ridings and really sort of formulating or working out what it was that we were trying to understand in itself was a bit of a benefit really of this research process, because actually the forming and the comparisons that we were able to do together, I think was really important. As a slight side issue, but actually equally important to the sector, both myself and Jan sit on our local enterprise partnerships, and in terms of those roles, we're somewhat of a lone voice, it has to be said, in terms of talking about the value and the value of the sector, but also parity for the community voice and the importance of recognising the contribution of the voluntary and community sector in our area. And so the report was a hugely important tool to be able to advocate for all the things I've just mentioned: better common working, but primarily that whole kind of political agenda around levelling up, and not simply north-south levelling up, but actually cross-regional levelling up. So as was mentioned by James and Lisa in their a bit earlier, that there do seem to be some quite stark disparities across our own region, and typically the areas that are more well looked after per head are those that perhaps need it the least, and obviously that in itself becomes a really important advocacy tool for us locally. And so as soon as the pandemic struck, the role of that report and the potential it then gave us to advocate was crucial, because it meant that we were able to make very specific recommendations in terms of where we could foresee there were going to be particular issues, and that actually brought us seats at tables. So I was invited to join the Economic Recovery Board for West Yorkshire, and was able to influence quite substantially the thinking of that Economic Recovery Board, which obviously in itself then led to leveraging further government support and government funding. And as we move into a devolved West Yorkshire authority, there's a new mayor as of last week. We're actually doing our best to build relationships and bridges with that in our new mayor, Tracy Brabin, and actually the ecology report and the data and the evidence gives us a platform to frame that conversation. And I think all of those things together, not that they're all equally important, but they all contribute hugely to a much stronger collective voice, which is unified, streamlined, because it's based on a common set of data and evidence. Hope that's useful.
Very, very useful. Thank you, Kate. It came across from both of you that it's been a very powerful instrument in so many different ways.
Forgive me, the one thing I forgot to mention, and was also hugely important, was we used that evidence to talk to national funders.
Yeah, we did, yeah.
And yeah, it's interesting, neither Abdu or I put that number one, but actually it was a really, really important plank in that advocacy piece was actually to approach some national funders who had some interest in working across Yorkshire and Humber, but perhaps were unused to the area, the geography, or were certainly not conscious of the kind of issues that were being faced by the region, and were not aware that the region had the lowest per capita investment across.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because it relates to a question that's been posted in the chat, which I'll float to both of you, which is about talking about the big funders, not just the lottery, but some of the big grant makers, ESME and the like. This question asks, so it says the lottery is the biggest funder in the region, but how does that percentage of money compare with its investment in other regions? And similarly with ESME and other big foundations, are they potentially overfunding in this region vis-a-vis others? Or the question then asks, is that not fair? Is that a fair way of interrogating the data?
I think at this stage it will be difficult to compare to other regions because this piece of work we piloted in Yorkshire and Humber, but I'm having conversation internally as to whether we'd like to do something similar nationally, just so we can compare the contributions from different funders. But what we did notice though with some of the national funders, over a 3-year period, some were making very few grants. Then that might be due to the nature of the program, but that led us to have conversation as to why that is. And that's why we brought the national funders together to give them more of a picture and a narrative about what is happening in Yorkshire and Humber, the contributions that we were collectively making, some of the gaps and the potential for some of them to think and consider making more investment in the area. And there was certainly some who were very keen to do more. And I think it showed also the fact that, for us as National Lottery and then Kate, Leeds Community Foundation, we're embedded in the community, we're closer to the sector. So, there's a link there where maybe some of those national funders practically don't have an individual in the region. So it's quite difficult to kind of, share information about your funding programs, ways in which you can apply. So raising that awareness in itself through the community foundations or through us and our links, is something that we've been able to promote a bit more.
Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah, just to add to that, it was really, well, perhaps unfortunate timing for us in that the way when we did get the national funders together, and I think there were about 6 or 7 different national funders who hadn't worked in the area who joined us. It was literally weeks before lockdown. So it wasn't exactly perfect timing, but it's a basis on which to build. And interestingly, the kind of conversations we've been able to grow with other national funders who have then come on to partner with us, they've found it incredibly valuable. So in terms of that question, whether there is a sort of disparity between the kind of scale of ESME's funding, for instance, with regard to other regions, I think this is just a strong argument that it would be great to get more data from those other regions. Obviously, we'd have to do that via ESME themselves rather than anything else at the moment. But in terms of our understanding was that what this showed us was that the per capita was right at the bottom or the top of this list of that's the wrong way around. So that was our spur to reach out and try and encourage other people to think about Yorkshire and Humber.
Great. Thank you both. I just want to bring in combine another couple of questions that have come up in the Q&A and link it to a question I was going to ask James and Lisa about some of the practical methodological challenges of this piece of work. Let me just get the chat. The 2 questions relate to, is there an opportunity, and I think you touched on this a little bit, James, in where you linked the funding data with the IMD data to show that there wasn't really a pattern there. But the questions are, is it possible to begin to map the sort of supply side of funding with the needs, the demand in the region in a more sophisticated and intelligent way? And linked to that, the second question was, is it possible, it's a similar question about layering, is it possible to layer the funding data with the local assets in the region so you get a sort of match there of, is the funding being attracted by the sort of so-called anchor institutions and other assets that exist across Yorkshire and Humber? Maybe James and Lisa, if you want to comment, and then I'll come back to our panel guests as well.
Yeah, I mean, if I can maybe try and find those slides on the sort of match up between deprivation and funding levels that I think But basically, as I was saying during the presentation, trying to match up the sort of IMD rankings of the different local authorities against the amount of funding per person came up with this somewhat sort of messy sort of pattern, where really there isn't at that local authority level much of a match-up to show that the most deprived local authorities are getting the most funding per capita. And I mean, there's probably a couple of reasons for that. Well, one is that we might be looking at the wrong scale, because even the most affluent local authorities are going to have pockets of deprivation. And if we're looking at a finer grain than just local authorities, it may be that there is more of a match-up between those areas and where the funding's going. And also, I think some funding, just by its nature, probably isn't going to end up targeted at particularly deprived areas. That example that I mentioned before, that I think Rydale on this list was skewed just by one really large National Orchard Heritage Fund award. I can't remember the exact project, but it was something along the lines of a restoration award for an abbey in the local authority area, and that kind of single large award can kind of skew these effects around deprivation.
Lisa, sorry, go on, James.
Sorry.
I was going to ask Lisa, did you want to come in on that in terms of that notion of layering data sets to get a more sophisticated granular nuance?
Yeah, I would add there's another challenge to mapping the needs and the funding together, in that what we're looking at is the beneficiary location. So that's where the organization who receives the funding is registered, but that's not necessarily where they operate or where the funding goes. So that's kind of a different layer that we're not really looking at, and it gets very complex because some of them might be operating across different areas, and then you would have to distribute. How would you distribute the funding if you don't really know the proportion? So it gets really complex. So all of this kind of where the funding goes always has to be interpreted with that in mind, that we are missing the next step of like where the organization is actually delivering the service. So that's one thing. And then in terms of mapping against other kind of community assets, I think this year we want to try and do that a bit more by looking at the charity data in more detail, so that we can get a better sense on across the region, how does it differ, where are different organizations registered, what do they look like. I imagine that it is similar to on like a bigger scale, that the cities will probably have larger charities registered there that then operate across the region, not just locally. So we get that kind of head office effect that we see in the Almanac on the local level as well. But yeah, we would want to look into that in more detail. And then combining them together is always a bit tricky. And then I guess with other community assets, we would be dependent on them being registered. If we start talking about local infrastructure bodies, identifying them, so that's adding a lot more things that you need to do to the analysis. And I guess we're always learning, so maybe in the next iteration we would add more things to it that we feel, it would also be important to look at the makeup of social enterprises in the region, for example, not just registered charities, because we're missing a whole lot of other voluntary sector organizations and all these other things. Yeah.
Thanks, Lisa. Abdul or Kate, do you have any thoughts on that one? I'm interested also in the issue about assets, because what we find in some of the place-based giving work in London is that assets attract funding. So where an area has good infrastructure, community anchors, that tends to attract additional funding, and it almost perpetuates a divide between hotspots and cold spots.
No, you're right. Actually, Leeds is probably a good example of that in our region. That's where probably there's more charities, sort of regional headquarters are based there. There's a very strong infrastructure organizations there as well. Very strong community foundation. So it will naturally attract more investment. But I think that's why the data is useful, because it helps us then have a conversation about it. So we might not have the answers, but we're then discussing actually what is the narrative we need to have in places like Leeds. So, I've always remembered that when I joined the fund in Leeds, they were still under the impression that they were not getting a fair share of funding, but actually using their data was to say, well, actually, out of 53 funders, 40 are investing in Leeds. There may be some national funders you may want to talk to try and see how you attract further funding, to try and support and sustain the good work that's been done by the forum. And that's really helped to develop, much better, much more constructive conversation with them, really. But again, I'd say the data itself is what helps us to develop those conversations. It's not perfect. I think there's always caveat with all of that, but it's the conversation, the insight you want to develop on the back of that, really.
Kate, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I've just answered one of the questions as well, in the sense that I don't think it's about necessarily trying to deprive the more asset rich areas. It's about trying to level everybody up to the level of the best resourced. And clearly assets are fantastically important. Although interestingly, on the ground, we're also seeing those assets can be a bit of a liability when some of the income streams to support those assets start to dry up, particularly when local authorities are being slashed to ribbons. So there's a it swings and roundabouts in some ways, but you're right, traditionally the assets can attract kind of more reliable, they're seen as a safer investment opportunity, particularly for people who don't know an area well. So I would always want us to encourage our communities to explore the possibilities of assets and see what they can do with them. And I guess my keenness would be for everybody to be as well resourced as London, so rather than it being some kind of, there's a leveling up agenda to try and steer stuff back down south, as it were. I just think we sort of start to poach on each other's territory. That's rubbish. That's not where we want to go at all. It needs to be about
zero sum.
Exactly. Yeah.
No.
Cheers.
And also adding to that, it would be too premature, because again, the analysis was only 53 funders who were willing to provide the data. So there's a whole picture we haven't got from the independent funders, and we don't have the pictures from other sectors, whether it's health, local authorities, and make grants, really. So we recognize we only have a partial picture of what is happening. So it would be very too premature, really, to make a conclusion as to whether money is well invested now, whether it should go somewhere else. We're having conversations about particular communities as well. So when we think about diversity and inclusion, are there types of communities not getting as much funding? So that's conversation based on the data that's helped us to think more, collaboratively as to how do we sort of level up or bring about equity in terms of communities. So a place like Leeds is a good example where, a lot of funding is attracted, but I think there's still communities, especially BME communities, LGBTQ communities, that are not getting the same level of support. So we're looking at...
Can I pick you up on that? Because that's a really good point, Abdu, and it relates to the last question I want to ask you before we wrap up. And I've just lost it. Hang on to it. You mentioned equity. So one of the funders on the call or on the webinar has asked this question, which is a really important one. So let's try and finish up with this. We funded, they say, we funded through the London Funders collaboration over the last year and have been impressed with the data on equity that they were able to get back from that in terms of getting money to groups led by the communities that they were trying to reach. So as well as talking about levelling up by place, does the data exercise you're going through or we're going through with you help show where we need to level up by equity so that we promote genuine social justice?
Well, I think we're probably not in a place where we can determine that with a lot of certainty, but the initial data we had, because again, what's difficult is funders capture data in different ways. And I think the initial conversation we had is that we needed to keep it simple as just the level of investment. And I think now we're in a phase where we want to try and get more information as to the types of communities, the types of organizations, where they are located. So I think we're going in that direction. And again, I expect this next research will have more question around it, and I'm hoping that in a few years' time we can have an even more deeper analysis of it. But what we're currently doing actually at the national level, we've been working with 360 Giving around capturing intersectional data around communities. So then we all have an ability to capture the types of communities that we support. So again, I think we'll be in a better place, I think, to understand our contribution, where there are gaps, and how do we make sure our response is equitable. So we're not quite there yet. I think we're having the conversations within the forum and very keen to do more around it, but we're going in the right direction.
Thank you.
Yeah,
okay. Go on, James, sorry.
I was just going to sort of reiterate what Abdul was saying there. I think that in the first iteration of this work, I think we weren't getting enough detail to be able to answer some of those questions around equity and the sort of type of organisation which is receiving funding. I think this time round we're probably taking steps on that path through a more sort of fine-grained look at some of the 360 Giving data and also the analysis of the Charity Commission data. But I would probably see it as sort of steps on the road, because I feel there still might be challenges with the data that's available, and also thinking about how to combine different sources of information, both on funding and also through the Charity Commission sort of recipients of funding. And that might be for version 3.0 in 2023 or something. Anyways.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm conscious of time. We were asked to finish at 5:02 and it is 5:02. I'm going to, unless anyone's got any burning things that they'd like to get off their chest or add, I just want to thank you all very much, particularly Abdu, Sadibi from the National Lottery Community Fund, to Kate Hainsworth from Leeds Community Foundation. Thank you both very much for giving up your time this lunchtime to take part in this. Thank you also to my colleagues Lisa and James for presenting on the research. That will be made available to participants through the outputs from the Learning Festival. Thank you all for attending today, and hope you got something out of the last hour, and have a good afternoon. Thank you very much.